He spent over a year in prison after being falsely accused of sexual abuse. George Cardinal Pell shares the second part of his story, Prison Journal, Volume 2, and reacts to some Vatican news. Pope Francis announces major changes to canon law governing sex abuse by clerics. The papal posse, Robert Royal and Father GERALD MURRAY, return with in-depth analysis. And China arrests a Catholic bishop along with his priests. Why is the Vatican so silent? President of the Population Research Institute, Stephen MOSHER, is here with an update. Finally, a tough new law protecting the unborn has been adopted in Texas, and the border crisis continues to intensify. How should the feds respond? The Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, tells us. The World Over begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. What a show we have for you tonight. If you'd like to comment, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Lots to cover. Let's begin. In 2017, Cardinal George Pell left the Vatican Secretariat for the Economy to face charges of sexual molestation allegedly occurring in his Melbourne cathedral in the 1990s. After a mistrial in 2018, a second trial unanimously convicted him, and he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Cardinal Pell was then incarcerated for 404 days until Australia's High Court unanimously acquitted and released him in April of 2020. He joins us now to share his latest work, Prison Journal, Volume 2, The State Court Rejects the Appeal. We discussed breaking news from the Vatican as well. Here's my exclusive interview with George Cardinal Pell from our bureau in Rome. Your Eminence, thank you for being here. In your new book, Prison Journal, Volume 2, you write about how someone had a dream and they contacted you with it, and they predicted that you would be free. You write in your diary, as someone who's innately skeptical but believes strongly in the reality of the supernatural, I would have been surprised if the situation panned out as predicted. I know, too, from my reading, of the slightest number of inexplicable events and coincidences, whether they be paranormal or supernatural, but that even in miraculous apparitions, e.g. Fatima, the specifics, the detailed predictions can be wrong. How did you feel the moment you learned that you had lost that appeal in August of 2019? What was the first thing that went through your mind?
How did I feel? Well, enormously disappointed. I thought it was logically inexplicable. I wasn't inclined to doubt it or think it was surreal, but it was intensely disappointing, and it was one of a series of reverses. So I must confess at that stage I didn't estimate the judicial processes very highly at all.
How did prayer sustain you through this period, Your Eminence? It had to be very difficult, considering, I mean, you knew you were innocent, and yet this steamroller kept moving forward.
Well, I received an enormous amount of prayer support. I had so many people praying for me that I wondered whether it was overkill. So I remember praying to the good God to say, well, look, there might be too many people praying for me, but you can redistribute these things. I followed a common sense daily rule of life. My prayers, exercise, sleep, watch the television, read, wrote. So the grace builds on nature, and with a bit of common sense living, that better helps you maintain your equilibrium. And I think undoubtedly all the prayers and the knowledge that I had so much support, that was a stabilizing factor too.
One of the peculiarities of your prosecution was the total media blackout imposed by the court. It forbade coverage of your case. Now, they claim they did so to prevent news of one trial affecting the jury pool or the outcome of the other trial. You were being tried in 2 localities. What does this say about the Australian judicial system?
Well, I think it was a reasonable decision. It didn't work to my advantage because once the facts of the accusations became public, public skepticism grew enormously. But I had the threat of another trial, and they didn't want to prejudice my chances there. Now, those cases were, a good number of them were thrown out by the magistrate. The others were thrown out by the judge as not worthy of going forward. But the basic decision is explicable in terms of normal judicial practice. But it didn't work out in my favour.
In December, Pope Francis formally stripped the Vatican Secretariat of State of its financial assets and real estate holdings. Now, this went into effect in February. Was this a good move toward financial reform in your estimation?
Well, it depends, of course, how it's managed under the new regime. But the old regime was so fantastically incompetent, at least, that, and I'm not sure whether they ever had official authority to manage such amounts. I'm not sure under Vatican law they ever had the right to own property in their own name, which helps explain why they went into these funny partnerships. So no, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. But the Holy Father said that an investment board will be set up that is manned by experts in investing. These things can be done. A man, I think his name was Svensson, just died recently. He was in charge of the patrimony at Yale University. For 20 years, he averaged 12.5% gain a year. The Vatican has lost hundreds of millions over the last 20 years, hasn't gained.
Yeah, they certainly need outside help. What does the Vatican need to do, in your estimation, to handle finances? I mean, Pope Francis recently ordered a 10% pay cut for cardinals, and he's looking to cut elsewhere, it appears.
Well, they're running a very significant deficit. It was an established sort of inbuilt deficit of 20 or 25 million when I left in 17. It's ballooned out to 50. It might be 70, 75 this year. When you've got an annual budget of 350 million, you can't be losing 50 million a year. Something has got to give. And on top of that, there's the pressure on the pension fund, which will become quite significant, certainly in 10 years' time. So the situation has to be rationalized in some way.
While you were in prison, the German bishops launched their Synodal Way. What did you think when you heard that they were preparing to discuss for 2 years 4 main issues: the way power is exercised in the church, sexual morality, the priesthood, and the role of women?
Well, I think the German church is at a crossroads. They have to choose to be servants and defenders and teachers of the apostolic tradition. So they stand under the Word of God, under revelation, under the teaching of Jesus and the apostles, or they choose another path and say that we are the masters of that tradition and we can change the teaching. Now, I don't know whether abortion and euthanasia are on the books. I hope not. But certainly they want to change the teaching on, some do, on sexual morality by blessing homosexual unions. They object to the tough teachings of Jesus on adultery and against remarriage. They seem to have a different list of qualities that are necessary for the fruitful reception of the sacraments, different from that of St. Paul. And some of them would want to have an order of women priests. Now, we can't have a German set of the Ten Commandments, and we can't have a set of women priests in Germany and nowhere else. So these things have to be resolved, and I think the situation should be explained as basically as I have explained it, so that people just know what is happening.
I recently asked Cardinal Mueller, who was on the program, his thoughts on what's happening in the German church. And, you know, they're defying the Vatican in so many areas. Here's what he had to say.
The Catholic Church, or the Christians, all the Christians have to follow the word of God. And this is a form of heresy, not only of schism, but also of heresy.
Your reaction, Cardinal Pell? I mean, a record number of Catholics have abandoned the church in recent years, 272,000 plus people leaving in 2019. Your thoughts on whether the Vatican should intervene at this point?
Well, the role of the papacy is to maintain church unity, and it's to maintain church unity around the teachings of Jesus, and whether they will cross the Rubicon, as they say, I'm not sure they will. I think if people go into schism, they would lose the right to church taxes. I don't know how it will be resolved. I hope the worst will be avoided. But the role of the papacy, and it's a concern for all the bishops, because we're concerned first of all with our own church, but with the universal church, the role of the papacy is to maintain unity.
Yeah. I want to get your reaction to the reports that we're reading in Italian periodicals that the Pope may undo Summorum Pontificum Benedict XVI's motu proprio, allowing wide use of the old Roman rite of the Mass, the extraordinary rite, at the discretion of the priest. Would it be a good idea to curtail the celebration of the old rite, the extraordinary rite, or might it create more division?
I think it would be most unfortunate. It would be counterproductive. It's been an area of unexpected growth. Many people are very attached to that beautiful form of worship. I don't anticipate that there will be restrictions.
Ah, okay. Well, we'll keep an eye on that. Since you've returned to Rome, Your Eminence, you've witnessed this Vatican financial scandal that you long suspected. In May, a UK judge set bail of $1.6 million for Gianluigi Torzi, the Italian businessman who helped broker that Vatican purchase of the London investment property. And earlier this year, a British judge blasted Vatican prosecutors for making appalling misrepresentations to the court about their investigation into the Holy See's investment deal. Do you think we know the whole truth of this scandal at this point?
No, I don't think. I certainly don't. I don't think. I don't know how many people do, but I did say to one significant Vatican official, for God's sake, get good lawyers who can present the case adequately. And you know, we want the truth, nothing more than the truth. Everybody's got a right to due process, whether it's Torzi or Cardinal Becciu or the man or the woman down the corner. We're a lawful society, and due process is essential.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I do want to wish you a happy birthday. You turn 80 on June 8th. Now, by turning 80, you lose your right to vote in future conclaves. Any feelings on this forced Roman curial tradition?
No, I think it's a sensible tradition. With the advance of medicine, you might make a case for it to be extended a little bit, but it's alleged that when Pope Paul VI introduced the limit, it was prompted by the fact that one of the presumably older cardinals voted for Cardinal Merry del Val, who had been dead for 30 years. So, I think the responsibility for church leadership remains with the people who are the leaders, not with the people who were the leaders. So I'm basically in favour of the regulation. I always have been, and now that I'm about to turn 80, I remain of that same mind.
Well, I hope they still consult with their cardinals who can't vote, because your insight is so important and has been, certainly during the last two conclaves. Before we end, the Pope has announced a rolling synod, if you will, that will take place over several years, where there'll be a local synod, continental synod, and then the bishops will come to Rome. And it really is a synod on synods. Does this go a bit too far with synodality? I mean, is there a limit to how long and far you should keep consulting? Now we're consulting about the consultation.
Well, we'll just see where this goes. I mean, we hope, as long as we're in a COVID world, of course, it's not at all practical. But in a post-COVID world, travel will be limited, money will be limited, and so I think that this is. I'm not even sure that there is a topic that is going to be discussed in these synods. So I think that will be rolled out very slowly, but we'll just see what comes. It's very early days on that.
Okay, we'll watch together. Your Eminence, thank you for being with us. Prison Journal Volume 2 by George Cardinal Pell, published by Ignatius Press, is available now at bookstores everywhere and online at ytsync-en.com. Cardinal Pell, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Thank you.
Prison Journal Volume 2, The State Court Rejects the Appeal by George Cardinal Pell, published by Ignatius Press, is available now in bookstores everywhere and online at ewtnrc.com. The Papal Posse is up next, but first, Pope Francis is urging the faithful around the world to pray during the month of June for young men and women preparing for marriage. Francis released a video June 1st announcing his prayer intentions for the month, titled The Beauty of Matrimony. Let us pray for young people, he says, who are preparing for marriage with the support of a Christian community. May they grow in love with generosity, faithfulness, and patience. And on this journey of life, the bride and groom are not alone. Jesus accompanies them. Here with in-depth analysis of all of this and much more is the Papal Posse. Editor-in-Chief of thecatholicthing.org and St. John Henry Newman Visiting Chair at Thomas More College, Robert Royal. And from Manhattan, canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father GERALD MURRAY. Gents, thank you for being here. We wanted to have you back because there was so much we couldn't get to last week. I want to start with some breaking news. Earlier this week, Pope Francis announced the most sweeping changes to canon law in nearly 40 years. The revision of Book 6, which covers penal sanctions in the Church, imposes much stricter rules and penalties dealing with sexual abuse. They also address clerics who commit fraud or attempt illicit actions like attempting to ordain women priests. Father, how significant are these changes themselves?
It's significant, Raymond, because it's bringing into the actual code legislation which the popes had enacted, this pope and his predecessors, over the course of the last 40 years, particularly, for instance, regarding ordination of women, and then different laws regarding sexual abuse committed by clerics. What's important, I think, in the general view and perspective is the reaffirmation that as part of the mission of the Church, she must use coercive penal means in order to protect the common good in the Church and in order to promote the reform and the repentance of those who offend against the law. And one of the big problems that we've had in the Church since the Council is the rejection of any use of penalties or what would be called coercive means in order to try to protect the interests of the flock and to get recalcitrant people to, obey law and to live according to the principles of Catholic morality. So it's a good improvement. I've started to read it and study it. There are a lot of technical things that need to be explored. But the general impression, I'd say, this is a good move, and I think it will highlight to the world that the Catholic Church is not simply out there saying, don't do wrong things. No, the Catholic Church is saying, if you do something wrong, you are going to be punished.
Bob, your thoughts on the timing of this? Apparently, this revision has been in the works, for 14 years. Why would it take so long to tighten up and strengthen these penalties, particularly for clerical sexual abusers?
It may be that there's been so much pressure put on Rome because of the difficulties we've had with clerical abuse and other problems within the Church that they felt that they had to act. I agree with Father entirely. As a layman, I'm not a canon lawyer, and obviously canon lawyers like Father Murray are going to have to go over this with a fine-tooth comb, but it's, to me, very interesting that they even explicitly in the presentation of this revision talked about how there was a mistaken mentality back in the 80s that punishment or using legal means was somehow not part of the gospel, that we ran contrary to the spirit of the gospel. Being soft on crime sort of means that you get more crime, and being soft on abuses like this means in the Church you're going to get more abuse. So I'm glad to see that there's been that recognition explicitly presented as the reform is there. And at the level of principle, this is a good step forward. I just hope that the mechanisms are there to actually put teeth into this, because a legal system without those institutions is toothless. I love a remark of G.K. Chesterton's about this sort of thing. He says, a good legal system is when we can identify that A says B must go to prison and C says when B can get out. We need that kind of specificity, and that's going to have to be implemented in institutions at all sorts of other levels.
Yeah, and we should say, for the audience's sake, this doesn't in any way undercut the role of secular authorities concerning the crimes of clerical sexual abuse, etc. Those still have to be reported. This is the Church's canonical penalty, not in substitute of the secular penalty. I just wanted to make that clear. Some, I think, are confusing the two. There are a couple of other canons I want your reactions to. One reads, Canon 1367. It says, parents and those taking the place of parents who hand over their children to be baptized or brought up in a non-Catholic religion are to be punished with a censure or other just penalty. And then Canon 1379 reads, a person who deliberately administers a sacrament to those who are prohibited from receiving it is to be punished with suspension, to which other penalties mentioned in Canon 1336, etc., may be added. Father, given the controversy about distributing communion to pro-abortion politicians recently, do these revised canons weaponize the sacraments? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I hate that expression, weaponize. That was used about taking chemical processes and putting them into bombs and then shooting them at your enemy. No, to uphold the canonical order is not to weaponize anything. It's to bring the gospel to bear upon human sinfulness and the desire for an orderly and peaceful society. On the question of baptism, the Church teaches that being baptized a Catholic is a gift from God, and that those Catholics who become parents have to give that gift to their children. They have to have them baptized in the Church. That's an obligation. It's not a suggestion. So to have them baptized in another church is a dereliction, and it's not what is intended by God. As regards the administration of sacraments, this specifically has to do with people who have been publicly identified as excommunicated or under a similar penalty. So if you have, for instance, a woman who attempts to become a priest and gets ordained by somebody,
Right.
She should never be allowed to then receive communion in a Catholic Mass. She should never be allowed to concelebrate, so to speak, at a Catholic Mass. Now, the question is about Canon 915 and politicians who become obstinate public manifest sinners. That's a little more complicated because the verification or to identify somebody as such does require some official act on the part of the minister who is going to distribute communion. Where that's in doubt, then you have to act, with more reflection. That's why it's so important, for instance, regarding our president, that the bishops make a statement here that it's incompatible to be a Catholic leader and to promote or finance abortion. So if that were to be done quite clearly, I think that this canon would then apply.
Yeah, Bob, Father referenced that canon, and I don't exactly know how it's been updated because I didn't compare it to the former, but the canonical penalty against ordaining women to the priesthood, it says that the individual attempting to do that, the bishop presumably, would incur upon himself an instant penalty. Does this end the debate over ordination of women, or is there still wiggle room since Pope Francis convened that study group on women deacons?
Yeah, that disconnect bothers me a little bit because I'm assuming that this revision of Book 6 of Canon Law could not have taken place without the Pope's approval. I don't know if he read through it. I don't know if he's deep enough in canon law to appreciate all the ramifications of what were in there. And obviously these are going to be debated, and we're going to be hearing a lot about this in coming times. But it's not only about that. It seems to me that if you're going to say that by doing something like procuring an abortion, you automatically are excommunicated and then cannot put yourself forward for communion. There are other consequences like this. For example, just last month, or in early May, the Pope organized, has tried to organize some mechanisms for the excommunication of mafia members. Now, a lot of us would think that mafiosi are murderers, they're criminals, and they should be severely reprimanded by the Church for that activity. Well, the Pope has also said that procuring an abortion is like hiring a hitman, like hiring a mafioso. So is his thought process going to be carried through in all those steps so that we can actually say that that legally speaking, that in consonance with this new thing that has been put forward, that the consequences are going to be that detailed, and this could run right up to the President of the United States. I think that this is going to be a big debate. It doesn't end anything. It starts things, but I think it starts them in a better place.
Last week, we discussed reports that indicate Pope Francis may restore heavier restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass, the extraordinary form of the Mass. This week, it's being reported by Diane Montagna in Rome that 2 curial cardinals are backing the Pope in this, Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin and Prefect of the Congregation for Bishops, Cardinal Mark Ouellet, both allegedly confirming that there is a document currently under review. Father, assuming this is legal canonically, the Pope has the ultimate authority here. Why reverse a motu proprio, a popular one at that, where the priests were given the option to celebrate the old form of the Mass or the new?
There is a lot of pressure on the Pope for getting rid of Summorum Pontificum from certain quarters in the episcopate and certain theological circles. They view the restoration of the Tridentine Latin Mass as being a tremendous mistake. I don't agree with that at all. And then we know that the Pope himself, as he's expressed on different occasions, thinks that young people who are attached to traditional ways in the Church are somehow reflective of emotional disorders and don't need to be encouraged in that attachment to tradition. I also disagree with that. Now, as from the point of view of the good order and life of the Church, Pope Benedict made quite clear that the celebration of the Tridentine Latin Mass is just one form of the Roman rite. So it's not really like conceding somebody a privilege to do something that otherwise shouldn't be done. No, it's actually just giving a mechanism for the orderly and free celebration of what's recognized as being valuable. And why wouldn't it be? This is the Mass that was celebrated essentially, from the 9th century and even earlier in the Latin Church. And it certainly was the Mass that accompanied the explosion of missionary fervor, the expansion of the Church in the New World and in Asia and Africa. So the lack of sympathy for the Tridentine Mass really bothers me because it displays a lack of pastoral charity for people who don't particularly agree with the perspective that some of these bishops put forward. I don't think it's not nostalgia to want to worship God with mystery and reverence and historical tradition.
But canonically, can the Pope do this? Can he just wave away a motu proprio of his immediate predecessor?
Yes, the Pope has supreme authority in the Church, and he can forbid this. He doesn't need to, no other authority has to confirm his decisions. The wisdom of the decision is subject to debate, but the fact that he can make the decision legally, that's not subject to debate.
Bob, essentially this would take us back to the days when permission of a local bishop was required for any priest to celebrate this old rite. What effect does driving the old rite underground again have on the faithful who've benefited from Summorum Pontificum, particularly the young people? I see them here in New Orleans, young families by the hundreds coming in and packing in to that Latin Mass.
Yeah, to me, this seems to be an overreaction on the part of certain people in Rome. Clearly, the Latin Mass is not going to entirely replace Masses in the vernacular. These have existed now for quite a while. One of the things I'm very worried about is, I don't think we knew this last week, but the jurisdiction over the Latin Mass used to be within Ecclesia Dei, which was a section of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It's now being moved from there to the Congregation for Divine Worship, where, as we know, the various people who have replaced Cardinal Sarah and others are fairly hostile to this Mass. So this seems to me to be a very strong signal that some people just find this a threat, and to me that threat is, the way they conceive of it, is entirely overblown.
The Vatican has announced that the Synod of Bishops on Synodality, I'm not making that up, is postponed until 2023. And there will be a 2-year consultative preparatory phase involving Catholic dioceses worldwide. There'll be a diocesan phase in October of 2021, where each bishop is asked to consult the local church. Then an ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops convenes at the Vatican in October of 2023. Father Jerry, this sounds a lot like a synod within a synod to discuss synods. What do you make of this? And how do the layperson, how do they decipher this thing?
Well, a synod of bishops is precisely a meeting of bishops, and I don't see the necessity for a 2-year process. On the other hand, I'm very aware of what they're doing in Germany, which is that the lay people, in union with the bishops, are coming up with a revolutionary program and promoting all kinds of things that are both heretical and immoral. We don't want that to happen in the wider church. Synodality as a way of consulting the laity, the bishops are the one who have the teaching authority in the church. And it's wise to consult lay people, but I don't think it's wise to create a 2-year mechanism where pressure groups are going to arise. They're going to issue all kinds of statements. They're going to demand that the bishops listen to them. I mean, think about the female ordination crowd, the people who will not accept the church's teaching that women are incapable of being ordained priests. They're going to use this as 2 years of beating the drums and saying, look, the Pope wants you to consult us. Well, this is what we're telling you. No, I hope that this process gets managed in a better way than I foresee, having given the German experience some consideration. Pressure groups who want to revolutionize the church are going to use this as a means to cause trouble. That needs to be stopped.
Bob, when I read this, I kept thinking, here we are discussing a process to discuss the process of governing the church. But at the same time, the Holy See is sending directives that they don't want bishops in the United States to discuss reception of communion among themselves. Is there a disconnect here?
Yeah, that's the great irony. Actually, I think what our bishops are proposing is what synodality would be in the best sense, that there's a local group of bishops who are trying to deal with a problem, and they're fully within their rights, and they're not touching the matter of doctrine. They're touching questions of how to implement that and how to make it more effective in a certain national context. Father is exactly right. The opposite is what we see in Germany, where they're off to the races as if synodality means that it's democracy. You can just redefine what you want. They've actually said that they're going to be conflicting and different visions of what Catholicism is. Now, to me, the process is very clunky, too. They talk about doing this at the diocesan level, at the conference level, and then at the continental level. There is a continental sort of bishops' conference in Latin America, but in North America, or Canada, and the United States, and Mexico is technically part of North America. Are we going to join together? I don't know that this has been thought through very well. It sounds like one of those things that you do when you want to give the impression of consulting widely and democratically. But man, it's it leaves a lot of chances to be abused.
Yeah, well, the Pope often said sometimes you have to make a mess. This could be it. Gents, we will leave it there. Commentary by Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray can always be found at thecatholicthing.org. Thank you both. Authorities in China have arrested a Vatican-appointed Catholic bishop, his 7 priests, and 10 seminarians. And China's announced a new 3-child policy, lifting caps on its own long-held 2-child policy. Why? Why now? Here to discuss this and much more is President of the Population Research Institute, author of Bully of Asia, Stephen Mosher. Steve, I want to begin with the arrest of Bishop Zhang, who was appointed by the Vatican and secretly ordained in 1991. The Chinese authorities say the bishop and his priests and seminarians are allegedly violating the country's new regulations on religious affairs. Now, Zhang, who heads the diocese of about 100,000 Catholics, was not approved by the state-run church even after that Sino-Vatican deal was signed. Why would the Vatican not have insisted that Zhang be recognized when they signed the deal with China, Steve?
Well, here's the thing. We now know that I don't think the Vatican insisted on any specific conditions when the agreement was signed, 2.5 years ago. And China did. China insisted on all of the bishops who had been excommunicated in years past to be reinstated. They were, but the Vatican, for some reason, did not insist that the dozens of underground bishops who are in the shadows, literally working in factories, working out of homes, trying to carry on distributing the sacraments, that they be recognized by the Communist Party. So there was no tit for tat here. And since the agreement was signed, as far as I can see, the persecution has only gotten more intense. I mean, they sent 100 policemen to arrest the bishop and 7 priests and 10 seminarians. Right. They're now going door to door in that area of China, that diocese, and they're looking for more seminarians. And actually, they're looking for more Catholics. If they go into your house in this diocese, these Chinese Communist police, and they see you have a crucifix or a Bible, they will confiscate the Bible, they will destroy the crucifix, and they will fine you for what? For being a Catholic.
Now, given that Bishop Zhang has been in prison on other occasions, what do you expect will happen to he, his priests, and the seminarians now that China's begun to enforce these new rules?
Well, I think that the seminarians, we know what happens to them. They've been sent home and told they must never, ever again think about studying to become a Catholic priest. In fact, they're being told that it would be better if they gave up their Catholic faith altogether and became, obedient minions of the Chinese Communist Party. As far as the priest and the bishop are concerned, the bishop is probably facing a long prison term. The priest will be told maybe they will be given an opportunity to join the patriotic church, or maybe not. Maybe they will simply be laicized and sent into the countryside. You can't, obviously the Communist Party can't laicize anyone, right? But if the priest continues after this warning to practice his priestly ministry, they will also be facing a long prison term. But I'm afraid the hammer is really going to come down on poor Bishop Zhang. He should be in all of our prayers.
I want to play something for you. This was at a press conference last week, wrapping up the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. Cardinal Peter Turkson, who's the prefect of the Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development, had this to say when asked by a reporter about dialogue with states who oppose the Church on essential elements of the faith, like China. The reporter asked, can dialogue occur if one side is unwilling to listen and act? And when does dialogue end, and when can action and proaction be expected? Listen.
From the part of the Vatican, since the relationship with China has got its own tense character on a religious tone, we approach the thing diversely through the scientific evidence and scientific seminars. So when we do organize events like biodiversity, we can invite a scientist from China to participate. When we invite anything that doesn't have a clearly, overtly religious character, then, the scientific evidence or whatever, then we're able to dialogue and to communicate on that level.
Steve, at what point do the religious freedom violations by China need to be addressed by the Vatican before other topics like biodiversity and climate change are discussed? How long can they be silent on this?
Well, as a Catholic convert, I don't think we can be silent at all about preaching Christ and Christ crucified. As St. Paul said, my goodness, that should be what we talk about in season and out of season. But make no mistake about it, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want a dialogue about anything. It doesn't want a dialogue about Taiwan. It wants to recapture it by force if necessary. It doesn't want a dialogue about the South China Sea, about the survival of the Uyghur Muslims, about the survival of Tibetan culture. It doesn't want a dialogue about the future of the church. It wants to crush the church in China. It wants to become the all-dominant force the Chinese Communist Party does, not just in China, but in the world. It wants to be a religion unto itself. That essentially is what it is. And I don't know what the point is of having Chinese communist scientists come to the Vatican and talk about biodiversity and completely ignore the elephant in the room, really the cross in the room, the crucifix in the room, that is the suffering church in China.
Yeah, religious diversity would be a better topic if you're going to talk at all.
Right.
On Monday, the Chinese government announced that married Chinese couples may have up to 3 children. Now, this is a major shift from the existing limit of 2 children after, I guess, recent data showed a dramatic decline in birth rates in China. They ended this one-child policy a few years ago. Does this really change anything, Steve? I mean, the government still is controlling the number of children people have.
Yeah, and the policy really goes back to 1954 when Chairman Mao said, as a communist country, we should control reproduction just as we control production. In other words, the number of babies born, whether or not any Chinese citizen has a baby, is up to the party ultimately to decide. So there's no privacy in China when it comes to reproduction, childbearing. It does mark the 3-child policy surprised me a little bit because it came so quickly after the 2-child policy. But if you look at the numbers in China, over the last year, the number of babies born dropped from 14.65 million down to 12 million. So they lost almost 20% in terms of this latest birth cohort. That's a huge drop. And the reason is 40 years of anti-child, anti-people propaganda. Young people in China don't want to get married, and if they get married, they don't want to have more than 1 child. Weibo, which is the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, has just lit up after this new policy announcement, with people saying things like, well, I wouldn't have a 3rd child unless the government paid me $500,000 to do so. The government isn't going to wind up paying everybody in China $500,000 to have children, but they may very well start telling them, for the good of the country, for the good of the party, for the good of the economy, you have to have a 2nd child or a 3rd child. I don't think we're going to be in the voluntary state very long, Raymond. I think we're going to go from voluntary to involuntary very quickly. After all, this is a communist party that for decades forced millions and millions of women to get forced abortions, some in the 3rd trimester pregnancy, some in the very pangs of childbirth were being forcibly aborted. It would not hesitate to force women to have children. So we may be seeing in years to come down the road, we may be seeing forced pregnancy. The party officials in China are already talking about banning condoms, banning contraceptives, and banning abortion, believe it or not. Not because they think it's immoral, but because they need more workers and soldiers.
Yeah, no, there's always an ulterior motive here, but it is interesting how quickly they're shifting. I want to move quickly on to Taiwan. You mentioned it a moment ago. Fast and Furious actor John Cena apologized to China for calling Taiwan a country in an interview he did with a Taiwanese broadcaster earlier this month. Cena got serious pushback from the Chinese. China is now, of course, the world's biggest movie market, and Cena, who apparently has been speaking Mandarin and learning it for 10 years, said this.
很重要，我爱更尊重中国更中国人，我很抱歉对我的错误。
The groveling there is embarrassing. Steve, what are we seeing here? What are we witnessing in the macro?
Well, I think that if he's been studying Chinese for 10 years and that's all he can say, he better find another hobby because the Chinese was broken and barely understandable. But he did grovel. He did say, "I'm really sorry." The fact is, it didn't do him any good, because they basically shut down his movie in China anyway. The box office receipts plummeted because in China, if you cross a line as far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned, they will brutally retaliate. And so he groveled for nothing. He kowtowed for nothing. He should have, kept his integrity intact and just moved on to make another movie.
Brent Christensen, the director of the American Institute in Taiwan, the de facto U.S. embassy, told an online news conference last week, quote, "Our obligation to support Taiwan in maintaining a sufficient self-defense capability against coercion remains a foundational element of the Taiwan Relations Act." Steve, will the U.S. continue to support Taiwan under the Biden administration?
Yeah, I really hope so. I lived in Taiwan for several years. I speak Taiwanese, Mandarin, and Cantonese. So I have many friends on Taiwan. You have on Taiwan, 23 million free Chinese. Taiwan did everything that we asked them to in the 1950s and 60s. They modernized, they democratized. They've been a full-fledged democracy for the last quarter century. They've had, a half a dozen elections. They've had a peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another, which is the ultimate test of a democracy, right? Peacefully transferring power after an open and free election. They're a model of democracy for China, and that's why they have to survive. They show the Chinese people on the mainland that there's hope for freedom, that there's hope for human rights, because in Taiwan, those things are respected. In China, of course, they're not. So we have an obligation, I think, to contribute to Taiwan's defense, not just for Taiwan, not just for the people there, but for the people of China, and really for peace in the world.
Stephen Mosher, we will leave it there. And Steve's book, Bully of Asia, is a must-read. It's available in bookstores everywhere and online. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Recently, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed a bill prohibiting doctors from performing abortions after a fetal heartbeat is detected. And as the immigration crisis along the border continues to worsen, what should the Biden administration be doing in response? To discuss all of this and more, I recently talked with Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick. Take a look. Dan, thanks for being here. I want to begin with this heartbeat bill. It was signed into law by Governor Abbott during a press briefing. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki reacted this way.
This is the most restrictive measure yet in the nation, and the most restrictive recent assault on women's fundamental rights under Roe v. Wade. Certainly the president supports and believes we should codify Roe v. Wade, and that is his view, regardless of these backward-looking steps that are being taken by states in the country.
Your reaction, Dan, is this a backward-looking step?
I'm always amazed at the left who likes to parade their view that it's okay to kill babies in the womb. If you want to be for choice and make your argument, I still don't agree, would never accept it. But they make their argument as if somehow those of us who believe in life are doing something bad, backward steps, saving a baby's life, an innocent baby's life. Raymond, we're, I think, the most pro-life state in the country. I've been a leader on that issue when I was in the Senate before becoming lieutenant governor. I passed the sonogram bill that requires a a sonogram of anyone getting an abortion, and we've saved about 20,000 babies a year for the last 10 years. That's a lot of lives we've saved. And so we've been on this issue a long time. What makes this bill unique, Raymond, different from anywhere else in the country, there have been a lot of heartbeat bills passed that always get stopped in the courts and really don't get into action. This is not a criminal bill. This is a civil case. So anyone in Texas, anyone can sue a doctor performing an abortion. Anyone in the state of Texas, and to protect that heartbeat of that baby at the 6th week. So what we want to do is look at the civil side, quite frankly, on this bill, and we believe it is unique. We believe it will survive all court challenges, and we believe it will save even more babies and put more abortion doctors out of business. I have no apologies to anyone. I'm not ashamed to say I want Roe v. Wade overturned. I want abortions to end. End of story. We need to protect innocent life in the womb.
As you know, the Supreme Court agreed to hear that Mississippi case which touches on abortion. It could dramatically narrow abortion rights by allowing states to make it illegal to get an abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Now, earlier this week, or last week rather, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal had this to say. He says it will inevitably fuel and drive an effort to expand the Supreme Court if this activist majority betrays fundamental constitutional principles. Chipping away at Roe v. Wade will precipitate a seismic movement to reform the court. He suggested, Dan, that could include expanding the Supreme Court or making changes to its jurisdiction. Your thoughts on the Democrats' vision here and what they're proposing if the outcomes don't come from the high court in the way they'd like?
Yeah, well, of course, look, we have to face this. There's an anti-God group in this country, and I'm not suggesting that all Democrats are anti-God, but many in their party are pushing back on life. And we know the Bible says born in the image of God. And they want to take over this country. They've removed God out of the schools, out of the public square, which we continue to fight back in Texas, by the way. But they want God on the sideline. Once you get God on the sideline, then who are you born in the image of? And so that's the long-term socialist, leftist, progressive, communist view of the Democratic Party. Let me tell you something very interesting, Raymond. A week ago or so, we executed a person who had killed his aunt with a baseball bat, beat her so hard that the bat broke for $30. And I had calls at the time in my office that they wanted to spare the life of that person. And I thought, these are the same people who don't want to spare the life of a baby in the womb. That man was found guilty by a jury of his peers. No question of the question that he was the person who did it. And they're trying to save his life. He's a criminal. The baby in the womb is innocent. I don't understand how the left says spare those from execution who have killed others found guilty by a jury, but it's okay to take the life of those who have not done anything. Because I get that question a lot, Raymond. Well, Dan Patrick, you're for the death penalty, but you're pro-life. Yes, innocent guilt. And they said, well, he's given his life to Christ. I said, great. I started one of the largest seminaries, I think, actually in the world. And we have 200 people in our prison seminary getting 4-year degrees to become pastors in the seminary, serving 20 years to life. But being forgiven by Christ for your sins doesn't mean that changes the laws of what different states have for crimes that are committed.
Dan, I want to move on to the topic of immigration before we run out of time. Yeah. Fox obtained video of at least 40 men crossing into the U.S. along the border in La Jolla, Texas. They're chased by Border Patrol agents. And then in the Del Rio sector, agents arrested 10 convicted sex offenders trying to enter the country. What do you make of the Biden administration's response to this crisis? And what kind of burden is this placing on the state of Texas?
Well, a tremendous burden. I just talked to the mayor of Uvalde, Texas, which is a small town and not too large of a town, and they're being overrun. They'd asked for help, and we're sending them the cavalry to help them. Everywhere you look, Raymond, this is the worst the border's ever been in, ever. We're totally being invaded, overrun from people from all over the world, whether it's the Mideast, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Central America, whether not as many Mexicans coming over. It's more Central America and other countries. And I look at it this way, Raymond. Not only are Trump had the border under control. We actually had the border under control. And I believe Biden, this is the short and long-term plan. They want to get we're going to apprehend 1 million people maybe this year across the border, and another 3 million that we don't catch. That's 3 million people. Do that the next 3 years is 9-10 million people. Anyone over 18, they'll register to vote. And they want those votes in 2024 to keep their leftist power. This is what this is about. And what is inhumane about this, not only is it harmful to Texas and the country, obviously, but these people. I'm going to text you a picture, Raymond. It just broke my heart yesterday. One of our women state troopers carrying this tiny baby yesterday. It just broke my heart to see this. When women and children come here, they often get put into sex trafficking. When men get here, young men, they're indentured servants. When the cartels send them here, they don't have all the money to pay them. So they say, when you go and work in the United States, we want 20-30% of your pay. And that 30% of their pay goes back, gets money laundered, goes back to the cartels. So the Biden administration is creating a whole new class of slavery. When we're trying to look back and erase the racial divide in this country over that issue, which was terrible, 170 some years ago, 150 years ago. Today, these people, they are putting these people into slavery because they're having to pay their wages back. Because if they don't send the money back, the drug cartels tell them they will hurt their families or kill their families. And the Biden administration is watching children, young women go into cantinas, go into prostitution, massage parlors, all of those things, doing nothing about it, and young men and older men being indentured service. This is a crime against humanity for those who are coming here. We need legal immigration reform. People need to come here with dignity, not live in the shadows. We love our immigrants, but not this way. But this is the worst. I mean, throwing children in the river over the wall. I mean, and Kamala Harris, who's supposed to be in charge, Raymond, she hasn't done a press conference in 2 months or whatever it is. She's never said a word. She's never been to the border. Biden is sleeping on the job. Everyone says, is this an accident or a plan? It's a design plan. If they don't know what's happening, then their staffs ought to be fired. Their head of border security ought to be fired. Homeland Security ought to be fired. They know what's happening. They know. Yeah. And they're turning a blind eye to this misery, tragedy.
Yeah. The human and financial cost of this is just unbelievable. I was stunned to learn that Texas alone is expected to exceed $1 billion just to try to secure the border that, frankly, the Fed should be helping you with. Dan, I know you're running out of time. We'll leave it there, but let's catch up in the days ahead. I thank you for being here.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you.
Finally tonight, some sad news. Sister Margarita Marchion, a religious teacher, Filipini sister, and tireless defender of the wartime legacy of Pope Pius XII, passed away on May 19th at the age of 99. The feisty Italian was a New Jersey native. She entered the convent in 1935, received the habit in 1938, and made her first profession in 1941. She served as a religious for 82 years, but she didn't take up the cause of Pius XII until she was nearly 80 years old. Convinced of the wartime pope's righteousness, she eventually published 6 books and countless articles about Pius's efforts to save European Jews from Hitler's evil. Here she is from one of her many appearances on this show. Why do you think there's such animus toward Pius XII
Raymond,
and an attack upon him?
This attack on Pius XII is really a direct attack on the Catholic Church. It's a campaign against Catholicism. Pius XII is just the victim in these circumstances. But what our contemporaries are trying to do, contrary to what the contemporaries of Pius XII said, what they are trying to do is to change the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Because the church is against abortion, because the church is against drugs, because the church is against pornography, they have implicated they needed a victim, and he's the victim.
May Sister Margarita Marchion rest in peace. What a fighter she was. That's all the time we have for now. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.